world where space and time are intertwined, one man dared to challenge the status quo. His name? Dayton Miller. His weapon of choice, a flute. But not just any flute. This instrument held the power to unleash the ether, a pervasive medium once thought to fill the universe. Miller, a physicist by trade, a musician at heart, discovered a harmonic resonance within the ether. He found...
All right, hello and welcome, lads and ladettes, to Ether Roundtable 112. Tonight we're going to be watching an interview with Dr. Bennett and the YouTube channel The Way Forward with Alex Zek. This was an awesome interview. I know Bennett's been on Widget's channel twice and did two pretty heavy, physics-heavy presentations, and then 2 or 3 presentations here on the Hildegard Ether model. And this 2-hour interview is a nice summary of all of those rolled into one with an awesome interviewer. So we're going to watch about an hour of it on a 1.5 speed to keep the conversation flowing there. But yeah, we'll just chime in every now and then. But yeah, this is a great recap on all of the fundamentals of like what's wrong with mainstream physics nowadays. He goes into detail, a recap of Michelson-Morley, the history of all of that. So this is an awesome history and physics lesson. So we're going to take the time to watch it. Anyone has any questions throughout the subjects that Bennett brings up or whatever, feel free to ask.
Well, I have a question. Is he a real person? Does he have a real PhD? Did he go to a real university and have a real job? Did he have a real thesis with impact in the field that he's proclaiming to have a thing in?
Sure did. He actually goes into that during the interview.
Perfect.
What I had learned about special relativity and general relativity was a false hypothesis and interpreted incorrectly by the mainstream of...
Did you say a little louder? Yeah. Gotcha. Actually, let me turn you up too. You're a little low. Sheen's good. Oops. Okay. All right.
the physics thinking.
We have Geocentrism, which is the idea that the sun is at the center of the universe, the earth is revolving around the sun. Then we have the geocentric model, which puts the earth at the center, but there's an even secondary take within that on geostatism. Could you describe what that is and how it differs from the traditional concept that is typically tied with geocentrism?
The Bible says the world is geocentric. The majority of scientists today are totally in conflict with that, not for scientific reasons, but because their moral principles don't allow them to accept what has been stated in the Bible. In this clever experiment, Airy has shown two things. Number one, that the earth doesn't move. Number two, that there is an ether that is affecting the starlight as it comes to earth. Geocentrism is proven, and the existence of ether is proven. What did mainstream do with this? They ridiculed it and called it Airy's failure. It was not. It was Airy's success. He successfully proved geocentrism and the existence of ether.
Robert, thank you so much for joining me. I am thrilled to be having this conversation. I want to give a huge shout out to Mark Gober, first for introducing us, and then second for helping me formulate some good questions for this podcast episode. For those who are not familiar with Mark Gober, I question how much you've listened to my show, and that's okay. I've had him on a number of times, both to talk about medicine and virology, but also to talk about his latest book, and Into the Upside Down Cosmos, which is a fantastic book that we'll link in the show notes. But I'm thrilled to be having this conversation because other than Dr. Steve Young, who I've also interviewed, I don't know of any other credentialed expert, so to speak, who is questioning relativity in the heliocentric model to the degree that you are. So you're the second person I've come across aside from Dr. Steve Young. Have you had any contact with him, by the way?
Only through email.
Okay. Be interesting one day to have you both on a podcast episode together to discuss all this. And it may be challenging, though, to break it down to laymen and women if I get both of you on the same stream, given your training.
Bring it down to earth.
Yeah, get down to earth, so to speak. Exactly. So could we just start by you giving a background into your education, your credentials, and then also your thesis, because that obviously relates to the discussion that we'll be having today.
Sure, Alan. I appreciate the opportunity that you've given me to promote my thoughts across the internet unisphere. I guess I could start with high school, where I got the interest in physics when I took it in senior year. I found that it was easy, it was interesting, and also I noticed that the rest of the class didn't seem to grasp things as quickly as I did. So I decided to go on to college, and I majored in electronic physics. And we had a co-op schedule, which means that we worked at local Philco plants. Philco doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be a company that manufactured radios. So I had a work ethic imposed by working half the time and going to night school, and then going to a full day schedule, alternating 6 months for the last 2 years. So what I majored in was electronic physics, but I also had 24 credits of philosophy, and I could claim that as a minor. And it's something I regret not having paid attention to, basically sleeping through classes. And now I think that philosophy is one of the most important subjects. Now that I'm up in my years and looking back, philosophy would have been something which would have greatly benefited me. So I had philosophy, and this is all, by the way, with Jesuit training, both in high school and in college. I had 8 years of Jesuit training. Some people would say indoctrination. This is before the Vatican Council. So this is before the Jesuits took a liberal left turn. So this is, if you want, pre-Vatican II. So a lot of the complaints that people have about the Jesuits today weren't apparent when I was going to school. It was a strictly disciplined education. Okay, after college, I went on to Stevens Tech to get my doctorate in physics. My thesis was on rigid body motion, which applied general relativity, Einstein's general relativity, to rotational objects in, let's say, in the neighborhood of the Earth. That is, satellites. And it turns out that at the same time, there was an experiment out in California run by William Fairbanks, which tested general relativity in space by testing the predictions. So my thesis was on general relativity. So I was definitely in the mainstream as far as the world is concerned. And it's kind of ironic that I've become a dissident as far as relativity is concerned. As I learned more and more after I left school, I've learned more and more reasons for questioning the very foundations that the mainstream physics group believes in today. So I graduated from Stevens in about 1970 with the doctorate in physics. I went to teach at Manhattan College. Where is Manhattan College? It's in the Bronx, of course, because it originally was in Manhattan and moved later to the Bronx. I also taught at a community college for a few years, well, 15 years. But then the world became aware of personal computers. So this was in the 90s. And I bought a computer and I started fooling around with it with languages that you've probably never heard of, BASIC and Fortran, PL1. All of these have basically disappeared as more programs evolve. Yeah, so I'm at the stage of starting to question the things that I've been taught. I was teaching at a community college for 15 years, as I said, teaching math and physics. And I gave a talk once on Einstein's relativity on the book that was written by Martin Gardner. And it was, of course, pro-mainstream. It followed the book exactly. And again, it's ironic that it's exactly what I would refute in terms of what I know today. All right, so I had the computer. And after about 15 years, I decided to go out into the world, get a real job, as they said, and worked for a small phone company in competition with Bell Labs, American phone meter. Then I worked, this should be interesting. I worked at Bell Labs as a consultant for about 4 years at the Hondo location. And I learned Unix because that was their corporate choice for language, for operating system rather. And I taught system analysis. In this job, I taught the business units in AT&T how to effectively analyze the problem using system analysis and then divide that up into parts that can be reused in future development. In other words, look to expanding the system while you're building it. So you don't have problems where the architecture is frozen and you can't expand it. Now, previously to this, I had worked in a company called Phone Meter, right? And that they had also done work with charging for the phone, how to know what your rates were, basically. After Bell Labs, I went to JP Morgan Chase, and I was hired there to introduce what I had learned at Bell Labs into Chase. Now, you may say, why would a what I knew in the phone company be relevant to Chase, which is a banking system? The answer is we had a system that we worked on called Milnet. Milnet was used by the military as a very effective way of communicating because it was almost impossible to intercept the messages, or as long as there was a connection somewhere between the points, the connection could be made. I used that knowledge of Milnet to introduce what now we know as the internet to J.P. Morgan Chase. It was known as Chemical Chase at that time. So my role was show the business units how to use the internet in their banking roles. And so in a way, I was in effect the first person at Chase to show the business units how to use the internet. Now, after that, this is the last year before retirement, I went to teach basically a charitable job. I taught a 7th grade at a Catholic parochial school. And then I retired at 65. And I've been doing research for the last 20 years on what really interests me, which is the topics you mentioned at the beginning, the roles in physics that everyone admires, basically, respects, and yet in many cases they're going by the authority of the mainstream scientists. And I hope today that we can expose some of the weaknesses in that thinking in our dialogue today.
I hope so as well. And I think we'll do very well at that, or you'll do very well at that. I'm just asking questions. So what led you to question relativity in the first place?
Well, there was a conflict in what relativity claimed through experimentation, which was principally the Michelson-Morley experiment. I'll refer to that as the MMX, which was done in 1887 and was a test for the ether to see if you could show that the Earth was plowing through the ether as it orbited the Earth, as it orbited the sun. Now, that's a refutation, if it did occur, that you could show that the Earth was at rest, would show that relativity is not really the effective tool that people say. The special relativity basically claims that the speed of light is always constant, c, and that there are effects that we can detect experimentally that confirm this. Now, first, I challenge that the speed of light is constant because there have been experiments like the Sagnac effect and the Fresnel experiment, which show that the speed of light depends on the medium, also on a speed which is not directly observable, but is detected by our instruments, and which we can identify as the ether speed. So what I had learned about special relativity and general relativity in my training was basically a false hypothesis and interpreted incorrectly by the mainstream of physics thinking. So relativity has become, for me, the first obstacle in my understanding or my acceptance of mainstream thinking.
Can you go into a little bit more detail on what exactly the Michelson-Morley experiment, the MMX, showed and how it was misinterpreted and used to reify relativity? And for those listening and watching, just to give some background context, and please fill in the gaps as necessary, Robert, relativity is a fundamental component to our current mainstream cosmological model involving how the Earth and the celestial bodies behave with each other. Would you say that's a sufficient way to briefly describe relativity?
Yeah, I say that's a good one-sentence summary. I think we have a graphic for Michelson-Morley, if I remember correctly. This is a model of the experiment, which should be familiar to everyone. If you have a boat crossing a river and compare it to a boat traveling the same distance up and downstream, so that's shown by number 1 and number 2, respectively. You can time how long does it take the boat to go across the river from A to B and back, or you can time it from example 2, going from A to C and back. Now, some people would say, well, that's the same distance, so it should be the same time. But it isn't, because the speed of the river affects the speed of the boat. The speed of the boat is constant through the water, but the water itself is moving. Now, it turns out that it takes more time to come back upstream against the river than the time that you save going down. So it would actually take you longer to go from A to C and back than to go across from A to B and back. And what has this got to do with the Michelson-Morley? Well, if we think of the boat as a photon, as a unit of light energy, and we send the photon back and forth across a stream of ether, assuming that there is a wind of ether. In the upper right, you see the letter V, which represents the speed of the river, but it could also represent the speed of the ether when it's applied to the MMX. Okay, so we have this experiment which is going to test whether it is true that the Earth orbits the sun by pointing the instrument in different directions to find out if indeed there is a difference in their time. And the way we do this with light is using an interferometer, which measures the difference in the number of waves that return when we know the number of waves that we sent out. In other words, when we see a frequency change. And this frequency change, called a fringe shift, can be visually seen on a screen, projected. And so this is a very clever way of making what is basically invisible, the flow of ether, and making it visible to experimenters by amplifying the size of the difference in the waves. So basically what we're doing with this experiment is trying to find out, is there an ether wind that goes through the Earth due to the Earth orbiting the sun? Now, the experiments at first were quite shocking to the mainstream because it seemed to show that the experiment was ether didn't seem to exist because the fringe shift, although very small, was considered to be zero or null. So they said there is no ether and that the Earth seems to be at rest. But there couldn't be any explanation of this in terms of the heliocentric model, which we have to go back to the 15th century to discuss. At the time of Galileo and Copernicus, that the Earth was thought to be the center of the universe. It was a geocentric universe, and that the sun was orbiting the Earth, just as it appears to be when we look at the sky. But they said that the sun really was the center of the universe, and that if you were on the sun, you would see the Earth orbiting. So the MMX was a way of testing this to see if we could detect the Earth's motion around the sun. As I said, there was a very small fringe shift, but it wasn't zero. But they claimed that it was zero and said that that proves that there is no ether. But then we had the problem, well, then how can you explain why why the Earth isn't standing still? They said that's because lengths contract and time changes, which is part of the special relativity theory. And if you apply these ideas, you can say that the reason that the light fringe shift didn't change is because the distance that the light traveled contracted in length, and that the time that it took to travel took longer. In other words, they said, no matter how you measured the speed of light, it would always be distance over time would always give you the value of c, which is 3 times 10 to the 10 centimeters per second. Of course, there were many reasons to object to this. It isn't logical to say that when like a ruler is in motion, that it shrinks in size, nor is it reasonable to say that a clock runs slower when it's in motion, because the first thing you have to answer is motion with respect to what? And this is what the experiment showed. So at the turn of the century, the 19th century, in 1905, Einstein had promoted his special relativity theory, which was designed to answer the MMX dilemma. It said that, yes, the Earth is orbiting the sun. We have a heliocentric system. And the reason this can happen is basically because lengths can change their size and clocks can run at different rates. And this is what has caused total confusion in over 120 years since that theory was promoted. And so I have reasons for disagreeing with the relativity experiment. And among those are the Newton's bucket and other experiments which were done by Steinach in 1913 and by Ruyan Yang in 2005.
Real quick, Robert, before we get to that, just so I can clarify. So the results, when looked at objectively, indicated a small fringe shift, which would indicate the presence of ether, but they put the results to 0. And then they, in order to explain the results, they had the presupposition that, well, we already know that the Earth is not stationary. We already know that it's a ball revolving around the sun. And because we already know that, in order to explain these results, it must mean that time dilates and that that light bends. And that's how they reified their presupposition when all the results really pointed to the presence of ether and the Earth being stationary. Is that correct?
Everything you said is correct, except light bending is general relativity, not special relativity. Everything you said is correct. Good summary.
Okay, so this is a pretty big deal then. So what we're talking about is this is a foundational experiment that was done where they had this presupposition about the nature of the Earth in relation to the sun. And the results indicated, when looked at objectively, the opposite of that. So they brought in, as a rescue device, relativity to explain the results, when, again, objectively, the results indicated otherwise. And from my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this Michelson-Morley style experiment has been repeated a number of times, and each time the experimenters got the same result.
Yes, I can explain why they get the same results. What they assumed was that if you had a vacuum, that would prevent any impurities in the flight of the light back and forth. Okay, in other words, if you could pump all of the air out of the system so that the light beam was moving basically in the same conditions as outer space, that this would free the experiment from any problems. This is what the experimenters had tried to explain, was the results of the experiment compared with the theory. Now, the experiment had some problems with it. The medium that was being used originally was air. So they said, let's pump the air out and purify it so that it's just a vacuum. But experiments since then, done by all over the world, by Airy in Russia, they have provided us with the knowledge that when you remove the air from the light path, it makes it impossible for ether to have an effect on the light beam, okay? The analogy that I use is a bathtub. Suppose you wanted to measure the waves in your bathtub, okay, for whatever reason. So you say, okay, I'm going to measure the waves, but the water may have impurities. So I'm going to pump the water out. I'm going to drain the water out of the bathtub, and then I'm going to measure the water waves. Well, what's wrong with that logic?
You're removing the medium that has the waves in it.
Right. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater is the expression. In effect, that's what they're doing. The air is necessary for the ether to interact with it and to produce the fringe shift. So as they pump down to better and better vacuums, they're declaring, we're proving more and more that light speed is always constant. Of course it is. You're removing the way to detect it. So that's the explanation for all of these claims that light speed is always constant. It isn't. If you measure it with the Sagnac experiment and with others, you'll find out that it isn't constant. It depends on the ether, and it depends on the medium, the air or the water or whatever's in the path.
So for you, when you were learning all this about the MMX, I'd imagine that this presented some glaring foundational issues with what you had been taught about, obviously relativity, but also the nature of the Earth, because the results would indicate that the Earth is stationary, and this has been repeated a number of times. So I'd imagine you went through a lot of cognitive dissonance with that.
Yes. But I saw the reason why. The reasoning was faulty. And that's because assuming that the vacuum is the ideal path for light. It isn't. Not if you want to detect the presence of ether. So since then, I've learned that there are other experiments besides Michelson-Morley. Michelson-Gale, which measured the rotation of the Earth, and actually was measuring the rotation of the ether around the Earth, and then the Sagnac and the other experiments.
Can you explain those just a little bit? If I think it might be interesting to explain those. You mentioned the Sagnac a number of times.
Yeah, that's also on the graphics right below where you had it. Now, in 1913, which is 8 years after the Einstein's relativity paper, Sagnac decided to prove that relativity was false. That is, that the speed of light is not constant. And he took a rotor rotating a disk, and he sent light beams around the disk, starting at one point and going around the circumference in opposite directions, one clockwise, the other counterclockwise. And you see that in the left diagram. If the disk is stationary, okay, as the diagram shows on the left, then they travel the same distance around the circumference, and they meet at the opposite diameter. Okay, no problem. Now, if I set this in rotation, what does Einstein say? Well, the speed of light would be constant. So the same thing should happen. If I rotate, the beam should meet at the opposite diameter, like diagram 1 on the left. What Sagnac showed was, again, the same situation, sending two half beams in opposite directions. The clockwise beam corresponds to the rotation of the rotor, and it advances past the opposite diameter. And by a distance delta L, shown in the diagram, it encounters the counterclockwise, which has been delayed or retarded by the rotation of the rotor. Now, the light and the rotor are not in contact. The light is traveling above the rotor. So through the space between the light beam and the rotor, there must be some physical substance that is rotating with the rotor and causing the delay of the right-hand light beam and the increase in speed of the left hand. It's a very dramatic experiment. It is involved in inertial navigation systems. It is used on boats, on planes, on satellites in order to provide a measure of rotation, how fast an object is rotating. So the mainstream cannot deny, Alec, that this exists. This is a well-known phenomenon, the Sagnac. In fact, it's in GPS, okay, which you must use the Sagnac effect in order to correctly predict the satellite time, the timing of the satellite signals. If you don't use the Sagnac effect, you can't do it. All right, so this is one experiment that shows that the light speed is increased by a speed v when the light travels with the ether, the rotating ether, and it is delayed by the same speed v, where v is the speed of the ether, which is the speed of the rotor. In other words, the rotor is dragging the ether along with it all around in the space all around it, just like if you had a wheel spinning in water or in air or in smoke, you would see the smoke or the water being dragged along with the rotor. The difference is you can't see the ether, but you can prove that it's there with the light test. This, as I said, is an indisputable test. Even special relativists have to admit. And by the way, Sagnac in his experiment, in his paper, mentions ether as a whirlpool that explains this 11 times. 11 times. And there's other, of course, this has been repeated. The linear version of this was done by Ruyan Wang. He used I call it an air glider, a glider that goes up and down on a cushion of air so there's no friction. And he timed the speed of the glider with the ether and against the ether, and he found the same result. Either adds or subtracts from the speed of light, depending which way you're going.
Is the ether a constant?
Well, the ether is, if the rotor is constant, then the speed of the ether is constant. In other words, it matches the speed of the rotor. What you have to distinguish is there's two kinds of ether. There's the ether that's dragged by the motion of matter, which is what we just discussed. And then we have to ask, well, what if in the universe there is something that can produce an ether wind, okay? Call that a natural ether then, right? So the results will be the same if I try to measure it with the speed of light, but the source could be different. Rotating mass will definitely cause ether, an ether wind. And as I could discuss later, is we've detected ether in the cosmic microwave background, and we've detected in other astronomical measurements. So there seems to be beams of ether that are coming at us from different directions in space. And we can get into the theology behind this if you want later on.
Hey y'all, I'm here with Melissa Kupsch from Remedy Academy of Homeopathy. We are so stoked here at The Way Forward to be partnering with Melissa and Remedy in order to spread the message of homeopathy across the world, and also to partner on the eventual development of healing
Can't skip, dude.
centers across the United States.
People are pretty quickly coming to realize that frequency is the future of medicine. We are witnessing the great resurgence of homeopathy right now. We're really moving away from that suppressive medical model, whether it's for eczema, asthma, hormones, fertility, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it is, it all starts as energy in the person's field first. If we change our field, we can completely change our life. Our 2-year academy is open worldwide to anyone who wants to become a homeopath. We've got 5 lecturers and we currently have over 500 students enrolled, which is record numbers in our field. A career in homeopathy is amazing for anyone who wants flexibility in their work and who wants to be valuable in creating this new world. We have stay-at-home parents enrolled, we have ex-medical professionals, grandparents signed up who want to learn how to heal their grandchildren and pass.
Even today, okay? And he also included an experiment that he did, which contradicted his laws. He considered a water bucket that was spinning in his laboratory up to the point where the water was spinning at the same speed as the bucket. Okay? He said, let me apply my laws, especially the laws of rotation.
Was some time dilation just happened? I think we're good.
Law, which says that the force exerted on a rotating object is towards the center.
No, we're in Newton's bucket. We're fine. Everyone knows Newton's bucket.
No, it continues off like right at that point because this was a commercial
Right here.
or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll try this one.
You mentioned Newton's
Bucket's
bucket.
so
Could you
important.
describe that a little bit as well?
There you go.
Yeah, that's one of the key ideas that I've worked on. Just to review historically, when Newton published his Principia in 1687, right, 330 something years ago, he of course promoted Newton's laws, which we all know. Newton's third law is the basis of mechanics, even today. Okay, and he also included an experiment that he did, which contradicted his his laws. He considered a water bucket that was spinning in his laboratory up to the point where the water was spinning at the same speed as the bucket. Okay? He said, let me apply my laws, especially the laws of rotation, the centripetal law, which says that the force exerted on a rotating object is towards the center, centripetal, and it's proportional to the mass, to the speed of the rotating object, and the radius, how far it is from the axis of rotation. Okay, that's it. That's the three things that you need to predict what the centripetal force is. Okay, so he said, let me measure from the laboratory what the centripetal force prediction would be. So he's not measuring, he's predicting with a law of physics. This is very important because this is what mainstream often blurs together. Kinematics is the physics study of measurement. So if you go into physics, there's two main groups you can join. You can be an experimentalist, okay, do testing, or you could be a theorist. Of course, you could be both, but in general, that's what you break down into. Experimentalist is kinematics. Dynamics is prediction of future events before they happen, of course. So that's what laws of physics means, dynamics, not kinematics. Okay, so he applied centripetal force and he said, okay, I see the water is rotating with a speed v. I see that it's a certain distance r, and it's forming a vortex. In other words, the water is creeping up the sides, and it forms like a U shape along the side. Everyone is familiar with this. You can do this with a glass of water and make it spin. Okay, so he said, does my law predict this? Yes, it does. If I know the mass of the water, the speed, and so on, and the rim, the radius. So he said, okay, with the bucket, then I can predict correctly what the centripetal force is. Now, if you're on the bucket, let's call it a bucket observer, okay? Someone attached to the bucket who is moving with the bucket. So to make sure you understand this, this means that if Newton sees the bucket rotating clockwise, then if you're on the bucket, you see Newton rotating counterclockwise. In other words, you see the lab spinning in the opposite direction to what Newton sees. That's what I mean by a bucket observer, someone at rest in the bucket. Okay, he sees that the water is not moving. So V equals 0. So he applies Newton's law and says, okay, so the force, the centripetal force should be 0. But what he sees is a contradiction to this. The water is not rotating as he sees it, but it is curved. It is a vortex. It's not flat. It's not still. So this is a contradiction to the laws of physics, but it did work in the Earth frame. It doesn't work when you're rotating. So since then, physicists have called this inertial frame, okay? Whatever the laws of physics obey, when you're in that frame, it's an inertial frame. Otherwise, it's a non-inertial frame, like the bucket observer. Now, what hasn't been shown? Well, let me give you the history. Newton said that the explanation for this was an absolute frame, that there is absolute space and absolute time also, so that when the bucket rotates with respect to absolute space, you get the centripetal force, okay? But then people said, okay, where should I put my observer that corresponds to this absolute space? And he says, no, this is just an abstraction. This is just mathematical space, okay? So he couldn't tell us where to put the observer so that he would...
Not to be confused with, regular space or something, or something physical.
Such a clever way to do it. I mean, this is such a verbatim recount of all of scientific history.
Newton did. The other explanation was by Ernst Mach, called the Mach's universe. And he said basically that inertia is causing the difference, and the inertia is being caused by the distant stars, the rest of the universe. So somehow the attraction of all of the masses in the universe produces this difference between what you measure on Earth and what you measure in the rotating bucket. But my response to that is, well, suppose I take the bucket from Newton's lab and I put it outside in the yard. Will it still do it? Yes. Suppose it's 100 feet in the air and I perform the experiment. Will it still do it? Yes. Suppose it's in outer space. Well, we could do that with the astronauts. We could test that and see if they predict correctly, since they're in a rotating spacecraft, if they predict correctly or not. And the answer is, you could put the bucket anywhere in the universe, and it would somehow be able to know that if it's spinning with respect to the Earth, then it's valid, then it's invalid laws. But if it's stationary with respect to the Earth, then the laws are correct. So if I extend the experiment by mental extension to consider the whole universe, then the answer is the Earth is the only inertial frame. It's the only frame in which the laws of physics are valid. I don't know why the so-called great minds in physics have not been able to discern this. I think, Alex, one of the biggest obstacles is theology, because if you go back to the Michelson-Morley experiment, the indication that the Earth was at rest, right, which is the null result, saying that, no, we didn't get any result for rotation, for the motion of the Earth through the ether. This goes back to the 15th century with the clash, the Copernican principle that the Earth is just an orbit, a satellite of the sun, and not really the center. Now, this is in conflict with the Bible, which everywhere says that either that the Earth is stationary, says it flat out, the Earth is at rest, it cannot be moved. All right, that's a direct quote. Then there's other similar quotes. There are a few quotes that say the sun and the moon were at rest, and this happened during Joshua's battle, when the sun and the moon stood still, so that he could win the Israelites could win the battle. Okay, but that's an exception. That's saying that normally the Earth is stationary and the sun and the moon are in motion. And then there's another one called Hezekiah's shadow on the stones on the steps of the temple, but that's unclear. Did just the shadow move, or did the sun move, which caused the shadow? In any case, you can't avoid it. The Bible says the world is geocentric. The Earth is the center of the universe. And scientists, the majority of scientists today, are totally in conflict with that, not for scientific reasons, not because scientific method has disproven it, but because their theological, their moral principles don't allow them to accept what has been stated in the Bible. So I think a lot of the problems today you can trace back to this conflict between religion and science.
Yeah, I have a question. The Copernican principle, from my understanding, is sort of indicating that we are not special, meaning like we on the Earth are not special relative to the universe, right? That we're just one of the many bodies floating out in space, revolving around various star systems, et cetera, et cetera. And that idea is a philosophical, theological assumption that has not been empirically demonstrated with any rigorous scientific experiment, correct? Like that is the foundational assumption that mainstream cosmologists and proponents of the heliocentric model are framing their entire worldview around. And then when, for example, in the MMX experiment, it indicates the opposite of that, they have to come up with additional rescue devices to reify their preconceived idea that we are not special, that we're just one of many rocks, quote unquote, floating in space.
Yes, they know what their destination is, and they have to figure out how to get there. And the destination does not include God. So, I mean, that is my general observation of all the research in all of my years, is that the core problem is not that mainstream doesn't understand the issues. I mean, they are brilliant. They're gifted intellectually, but they are weak in logical principles. And they resist the truth, even when it is demonstrated using the scientific method. I mean, the Signac method that I showed you and other experiments can't be denied. And yet they are not interpreted correctly. Even the MMX, their calculation of what the fringe shift should be is incorrect. Okay, so it should be small, but it isn't zero. That's what they claim allows them to say that the speed of light is always constant, because they never see any ether change. Well, I'm working right now on a theory that will explain how big the fringe shift should be. And it's actually in the hundreds of kilometers per second, which is much faster than the Earth is supposed to be going around the sun. Actually, the sun is going around the Earth. That's 30 kilometers per second in the geocentric model.
Real quick, well, yeah, I have another question regarding the Copernican principle. So could you just share some of the, other than what we've already discussed, some other observational anomalies, so to speak, like the axis of evil in the cosmic microwave background? And also, like, why do cosmologists literally label that evil?
Yeah, it's good that you picked that up. I didn't mention that I co-authored a book with Robert Sungenis called Galileo Was Wrong. I'm not really a co-author. He is the main author, did all the work. I contributed a chapter, so I am a contributing author. Anyway, that book explains a lot of the questions that you've asked and others regarding the true meaning of the universe, the true theory of the universe. That's the cosmic microwave background. Okay, that was discovered accidentally a mile away from where I was working at Homedale. I said in New Jersey. Not when I was there, but before, a few miles down the road, 2 Bell Labs scientists were doing microwave investigations of the sky, and they found out that there was a constant hum in their receiver. To make a long story short, it turned out that it's the cosmic microwave background. Now, what we see in the sky at night is, of course, are the stars giving visible light. But what we cannot see, because our eyes are not sensitive to it, are the microwaves or all other infrared, ultraviolet, everything else is invisible. But with this instrument, they can detect this low temperature, 2.7 degrees Kelvin. That's absolute temperature, not centigrade, which is 273 degrees below zero on the centigrade scale. So it is very cold in space, yes. And it is basically uniform, except that there are slight fluctuations, slight pinpoints of microwave radiation that are either slightly above or below that level, 2.7. So they look to see, is there a pattern? First of all, the Big Bang enthusiast said, oh, this is the proof of the Big Bang. This is the explosion of nothing that happened at the beginning of time, and it's been cooling off. So it is now 2.7 degrees. It was once much hotter. It was like the sun. So they said, they were very enthusiastic. They said, this is proof of the Big Bang. And they said, if you were in any other place in the universe, you would see the same sky.
Look at all that nothing up there cooling off.
Look at all this nothing we found over here.
Sky. You would see the same pattern because it's spread out from the beginning, from the same center. And so when you look at that initial radiation, they call it the remnant radiation from the Big Bang, you would see the same pattern no matter where you were. So suppose you were in Andromeda, Alec, on a star system, okay, on a planet in the star system. You looked up at the sky, you would see the same pattern that we see, okay, because of the Big Bang assumption. Well, what did they find? And why did they term it the axis of evil? Well, it turned out that there was a dipole. That means there's a left to right radiation pattern in the straight line, okay? One of it is pointed towards the constellation Leo, and the other is in the opposite direction, the other end of the dipole. Now, this dipole is interpreted as the motion of the Earth with regard to the true center of the universe, the cosmic microwave background origin. Okay, so that's the way they say, oh, this dipole is our so-called Doppler shift. Okay, when something radiates while it's in motion, it produces a frequency shift. The Doppler shift. This is the principle of the cop's radar. Okay, they can tell how fast you're moving by bouncing radar off the car, and the shift in the frequency tells how fast you're going. All right, this is at a cosmological scale, though, and this is the basis for the axis of evil, because the dipole not only is supposedly showing our motion through space, it is also pointing in a direction which corresponds with the equinox, okay? The equinox is the 2 points where the sun's elliptic motion around the Earth crosses the equator, okay? It's in the March and in September. That corresponds then to a characteristic of the Earth. More things that they've discovered about the dipole and the quadrupole and the octopole, which are higher level poles, that they align with the ecliptic, that is the sun's orbit, as well as with the equinoxes. So if you're this guy in Andromeda looking at the sky, you see the same pattern that we see on Earth. But why should he see the pattern on Earth that we see? Because only our sky has a sun with an elliptic orbit, and only our system, okay, has the equator where the Earth's equator is. All right? Have you heard this mentioned? No. All they tell you is it's an axis of evil. It's evil because it's contrary to what they are promoting as a Copernican principle. In fact, they have a cosmological principle, right? Which says everywhere in the universe is the same. Okay. Copernican principle just says the Earth is no different than everything else. Cosmological principle says we're in no special place. Everything else, everywhere else is the same. Of course, you can't prove this because you'd have to be outside the universe to look at it, to see it. If you're outside the universe, then you don't exist. Right? There's such a web of illogic, unbelievable. Anyway, you brought up the axis of evil. That's why they call it evil. Because it's evil to their way of thinking.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Because the devil has anything to do with it. No.
It's evil because it might indicate that they have to believe in a creator in some way. and that the Earth is special. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So another thing that was mentioned in the PDF that you sent me was Airy's failure, and I know that also relates to falsifying the heliocentric model. Can we discuss that a little bit, and I'll pull up the chart?
Okay, Airy's failure is a key experiment. You see the date 1871. So they were in the controversy of, is the world heliocentric or geocentric? And it was the beginning of the ether theory, which was prevalent because of Maxwell's research in electromagnetism and the proof that a light wave is really an electromagnetic wave having a particular wavelength and frequency. Okay, so why is this important? Well, in this historical setting, Airy's response, is the world geocentric or heliocentric? And it also answered the question, is there an ether or not? This is one of the key experiments in my library of dissidence response to mainstream. Okay, George Airy was the royal astronomer at this time, so he was no slouch. He was in charge of the observatories in England, and he did an experiment, which I'm going to try to summarize, starting with the upper left. We have a stationary telescope aimed at some star, and we consider that what we observe is that we can never see the starlight directly, but we have to tilt the telescope at about 5 degrees. This is true for all stars. Let's say the tilt is 5 degrees. It's a small number. It doesn't matter what it is. It matters that you have to tilt it in order to get the star focused at the bottom of the telescope. So one of the theories would be, supposing that there is no ether. So you see at the top there, I have ether V equals 0. No ether. Well, if the telescope was on Earth, it would be moving with the Earth. And that would explain why you have to tilt the telescope, because the light beam, when it comes in, if it's tilted, would have to be tilted to match the speed of the Earth. The next diagram to the right shows, what if I had ether moving to the right? Then the ether would push the light beam to the left, and the light beam would enter the telescope tilted as it is shown in the diagram, and that would be possible with a stationary telescope. So what those two diagrams show is, well, the light beam could be tilted because the Earth is moving, or the Earth could be stationary, and the ether could be pushing the starlight and bending it 5 degrees. Okay, so the question is, which one is it? Go to the lower left. We add water. This is very clever of this guy. He adds water to slow down the light beam as it goes from the top of the telescope to the bottom. If it slows down, then if the Earth is moving, then it's going to be moving too slow to hit the bottom of the telescope. As the diagram shows, it will hit the side of the telescope. So with the 5 degrees tilt, which we know will make the starlight hit the bottom, if we add water, then that should make the beam hit the side of the telescope if the Earth is moving. All right, so this is a good test. Is the Earth moving or not? All right, if we can't see it after we add the water, then that means that the Earth is moving. And the next diagram shows, if we tilt the telescope, let's say 10 degrees instead of 5, then we should have a moving telescope and ether still equals 0. But what actually happens is, as shown on the right, the telescope must be stationary, because if I add water, it hits the bottom of the telescope, which is the fifth diagram. If it hits the bottom of in the fifth diagram, then it shows that the water is unaffected by, the light beam is unaffected by the water, and it strikes the center of the telescope. So adding water in the short does not change this, but it would if the telescope were moving. So the conclusion is the telescope is not moving, and which means the Earth is not moving. The last diagram shows that if you have the ether coming in at an angle of 5 degrees and a stationary telescope in the water, then the only way you can explain why the light doesn't come directly from the star, which is the blue arrow, is that the ether is pushing it sideways. In this clever experiment, Airy has shown two things. Number one, that the Earth doesn't move, and number two, that there is an ether that is affecting the starlight as it comes to Earth. And this is called aberration. This is the aberration that we're talking about. Those yellow lines represent light coming into telescopes at different places on Earth. As you see at the pole, North Pole, you have to change the direction of your telescope over the path of a circle during a year. So this represents an entire year of observing the stars. And this is true for all stars. All right? So it's something that is happening to all of the light that comes to us into the solar system It's all being bent by ether, an ether wind, which is perpendicular to the flight of the light. At the mid-latitude, you see that the pattern is an ellipse. As you get further down to the equator, you see that it degenerates to a line. So you move the telescope back and forth in a line, not a circle, if you're at the equator. All of these can be explained by Airy's experiment. Number one, the water doesn't change the path of the light, which means that it's coming into the telescope already bent. And if that's true, then the Earth is not moving, and the ether is causing the bending of the light. Two birds killed with one stone. Geocentrism is proven, and the existence of ether is proven. And what did mainstream do with this? They ridiculed it and called it what? Airy's failure. It was not. It was Airy's success. He successfully proved geocentrism and the existence of ether.
That's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big deal.
And you know why it's a big deal? Because you can tell. They ignore it.
Right.
They ridicule it. They call it, they say when you're in opposition to the mainstream science, the first thing they do is ignore you. Then they ridicule you. Then they challenge you at all points until finally, when a generation has passed and the objectives have all died, the younger generation says, oh yeah, this is obvious. That's the way a paradigm shifts, right? From one way of thinking to another. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to get rid of all of the ones who are frozen in their thinking. And you have to have a new generation that is open to new ideas.
Amen. I think my generation and the generations below me are definitely open to new ideas. So it's good.
By the way, I interact with a Discord channel, Ether Cosmology. That's the channel.
Oh, shit.
And I have very interesting discussions with them. And we do different presentations. You had Austin Whitsitt on, and I was on his program, on his channel, discussing basically the same ideas for, I think it was about a year ago.
That's awesome. I really like Austin. If you listen to this podcast, chances are you're focusing on your health and recovery.
Dude, that was a lot. Is that the
Yeah.
first hour?
Yeah, we could wrap it up there. But yeah, that was an awesome interview. Great breakdown into every
Dude,
nice, concise
that-
summaries.
That dude just has all that knowledge in his head, like off the cuff, no reference to a book, no notes, no obsidian, just, oh, you want to talk about my favorite things? Did you know that my major thesis was on the relativistic of rigid bodies? Did you know that? Like, oh, dude, the way that people, is he qualified? Literally one of the most qualified people to shit on relativity that's ever existed. So, there you go. Like, that's why his position is so damning to them. They're like, well, no, he can't be real or accredited or right or whatever. One of these things can't be.
Yeah,
that was an
that's-
awesome interview.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah, that's what they have
Hey,
to
you
do to
know-
everyone that dissents from relativity theory. They have to just discredit them by saying that, they're a quack now and whatnot.
It
'Cause
took us
there's-
months to read the papers that he just summarized in like 60 minutes, though, like months to understand the background for like what he's talking about, the shifts, the historical recontextualization, and he laid it out so succinctly, dude. Like that, like, so what that means is this dude just has this information on lock in his head all the time, and he's breaking it down as if he would for children, like your little grandchildren, and he's telling you, honestly, like, here's what happened in the 1900s, lads, just so you guys know, here's how it went down.
It's awesome.
You know, at least he takes people like a third of the way by making the Earth geocentric. So because I think of the flatness and all that, that's too much for the regular people. But this kind of makes more sense of just giving them a part of the pie rather than the whole pie. And
I would be
have my
so
own-
content if they were all switched to his position, to be honest.
Yeah. I have my own theory about the ether wind, by the way, and I think it's the spinning dome. I think that dome,
What?
it probably spins, the dome that's above us. I think it spins so fast that it creates the ether wind. That's my theory.
I think Bennett has some equations that describe exactly that. Or if not Bennett, it was something else I came across that was similar. I'll see if I can find it for you, Lily. But yeah, that can definitely be made into a mechanism. But it's all just math
I
for
mean,
funsies.
Are you sure it's not just a field of abstract math, Liliana? Are you sure that's not the cause? Like you said.
Okay, Lily. So suppose that instead of the firmament, it's everything in the universe.
Well, I believe that there is a dome because, what else is keeping our air contained? So that dome obviously spinning because we're watching it spin. So, in the form of the star spinning. So if there's a physical dome and it's spinning super fast, I mean, God knows how many thousands of miles away from us it is, probably really, really far. But that's probably what's causing the ether wind. Because let's just say it's spinning at like 15,000 miles an hour. That would cause some kind of ether wind, That's my theory anyway.
Not a bad one.
I think I stole those equations. I think they're right here. Hold on.
Nice. Dude, my favorite thing is ripping equations that describe firmament rotation and sidereal ether fluctuations. Yep, there it is. Nice. Nice. All right. Well, the links to the interview are in the chats there. So if anyone wants to finish out the interview, highly recommend. He goes on to talk about the Hildegard ether model and breaks that down and very succinctly. So awesome interview. Shout out to Alex Zek. And shout out to Dr. Bennett for dropping all that knowledge and bestowing it upon us and helping us understand it.
For real. What a godsend he's been. So helpful.
All right. We'll be back on Friday for Twitter Community Night. And then Sunday, Vanby will be presenting on Globebusters a little something about refraction demonstrations in the lab, where some lads are using a different medium to project an image when they should be using a singular homogeneous medium with a temperature gradient fluctuation. But to date, that has never been done. And I'm going to go ahead and give a little spoiler. I'm pretty sure on Sunday, he's not going to find any examples of that being done in between now and Sunday. So we'll be to tune in for that.
Strange things are afoot at the Circle K.